Now, straight to the colloquium. Agnes Callard, Socrates on sincerely asserting what you don't believe.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. This is a wonderful group of people to get to talk to. So what I want to talk about is the experience of being wrong. And it can be a little bit hard to put your finger on what that experience could be. It's different from, if you think back to something you were wrong about in the past, what you're really doing is thinking about how right you are now, right? At least you're not making that mistake anymore. It would be really different to realize that you are right now currently thinking about something incorrectly, right? That's the experience that I'm trying to grab onto. And it's difficult to grab onto it because error doesn't tend to survive introspective awareness of itself, right? When you catch your mind going astray, at that very moment, your mind cleans up its act. As soon as you realize it's a mistake to think something, you become unable to make the mistake of thinking that. And so, you could still think about it. You could think about it as something you used to think, as something someone else might think. You can look at the erroneous thought, but you can't look at the world through it. So it seems like our errors are blind spots. And now you might think, well, that's maybe not such a big problem that our errors are blind spots, because we can learn that we were wrong, and maybe that's good enough, right? We can sort of the demand to be able to see one's own blemishes, right? It would only be really pressing if there were a set of blemishes that you could only get rid of by seeing them. So are there mistakes that we're making that we're unable to stop making unless we see that we are making them, not that we were making them? I think there are such mistakes. And so I think if it were true that we couldn't see that we are wrong, we would be in big trouble. So I want to bring out how Socrates helps his interlocutors see this sort of mistake, see themselves going wrong, and talk about what kind of mistake that is. Okay. So I'm going to start by, most of this talk is going to be about the Alcibiades. But I want to start by sort of stepping back and trying to give you a sense of why this problem of seeing that you are wrong is such a big problem, why it almost just seems like impossible or sort of a conceptual mistake or something to think that someone could see that they are wrong. Why you might think that blind spots are sort of in principle invisible, right? So here's a famous way to make the case that blind spots are in principle invisible. It's Moore's paradox, right? So consider the sentence, it's snowing in Chicago, but Jones doesn't believe it, right? And I'm gonna open the chat and put it in the chat. And there's some passages in the chat that I'll get to later. Okay. There's a sentence, okay? So that sentence might be true and I might know it and you might know it and everyone in Jones' family might know it, but seems like there's one person who can never know it, and that person is Jones, right? Jones can't believe or sincerely assert that it's snowing in Chicago, but I, Jones, don't believe that. The problem here is that part of the sentence describes the way the world is, and the other part describes Jones's mental states, but Jones himself can't be aware of the specific way that his mental states diverge from reality, because that very awareness would constitute a correction. It's different if the two clauses are like going to be different in tense, right? So it's not a problem for Jones to say, it's snowing in Chicago, but I, Jones, didn't used to believe that. Or it's snowing in Chicago, but I, Jones, won't believe that in the future. Like he could say that if he knows he's a forgetful person or something, right? Sentences that fit the pattern, X is the case, but I don't believe it is, right? Or the subtle but importantly different variant, X is the case, but I believe it isn't. I'll put those in the chat. These are these are called Moore sentences, right? After the philosopher G.E. Moore, who first singled them out for sort of philosophical discussion. And the reason why it's called Moore's paradox, right, is that the claim that these sentences are not such as to be believed or sincerely asserted stands in tension with the natural assumption that anything true can, at least in principle, be asserted or believed by anyone, right? So there's a kind of dilemma between the unassertability of a special set of sentences and the accessibility of all truths. And that dilemma is Moore's paradox. Now, the standard solution to Moore's paradox is to grab one horn of the dilemma, namely the one where we discard the natural assumption, right? So contrary to appearances, not all truths are accessible to everyone. It's possible to just be ill-situated with respect to a given truth. Blind spots exist, right? So I want to argue that even if we accept this solution for some Moore sentences, we shouldn't be equally ready to accept it for all of them. That is, there are some Moore sentences that I'm going to call stubborn Moore sentences. They're a special class of Moore sentences, and we should want a different account of them. Okay, but now let me just talk about them more generally. So every Moore sentence makes reference to a divergence between someone's beliefs and the way things are, right? For example, it's snowing, but I don't think it is, or it's snowing, but I think it isn't, right? That's a divergence between my beliefs and some facts about the weather. The standard solution says that as long as this divergence exists, I can never learn that it does. But notice that something I can do with reference to that specific divergence is, like, say, to resolve it by inquiring about it, right? So, like, suppose that it's snowing, but I don't think it is. I could, suppose that's the case, right? It's snowing, but I don't think it is. So I don't think it's snowing, but I could still ask, is it snowing? I don't think it's snowing, but I can ask, is it snowing, right? And then I could come to learn, like by looking out the window or checking the weather report, that it is, right? In effect, you could say, is it snowing is like saying, I don't have the belief that it's snowing, but is it? You could call that a Moore question, right? But it's perfectly intelligible. There's no problem with it, right? I'll put it in the, and similarly with, it's snowing, but I think it isn't. If I wrongly think it isn't snowing, I can still inquire into whether that's in fact the case, right? I can say, well, I believe it isn't snowing, but let me check on that anyway, right? That's also a Moore question. Like, I believe it isn't snowing, but is it, right? And so what's, these kind of Moore questions, right? Where I could sort of inquire about beliefs that, like, with reference to beliefs that I already have, and inquiries that, if they were successful, would lead my beliefs to align with the way the world is, right? And then the Moore sentence would no longer be true of me. These are possible because even when I have a belief, I can suspend judgment with respect to that belief, and it's perfectly coherent that I might do that, right? So even though I don't believe that it's snowing, I can ask whether it's snowing. Even though I do believe that it's snowing, I can ask, am I right to believe that it's snowing? And so in these cases, the Moore question is independent from the Moore sentence. I can ask the Moore question even if I can't assert the Moore sentence. The question is freer than the sentence, right, than the assertion, because the question makes use of suspension of judgment, right, both with reference to what I already believe and with reference to what I might come to believe. But what about cases where I can't suspend judgment? Okay, now here, so in effect, what I've done is I've said, with a lot of Moore sentences, with basically all standard Moore sentences that people give you, though I can't assert the Moore sentence, I can come to learn that I was wrong. I can come to rectify the divergence between my beliefs and the way the world is by inquiring. Right? But now I have to take a step back and tell you something about some of the stuff I've argued for earlier in my book. Okay, so we're in like chapter 4 of my book here. So one thing I argue from my book is that there's such a thing as a mandatory question, which is a question whose answer we can't live without, right? So the answer is load bearing. You are using the answer in acting, and it can't be unseated without uprooting your life. And so, like, an example of this is actually any ordinary action. Like, I'm going to the supermarket, right? If I'm going to the supermarket, I think I know where the supermarket is. I can't be asking where the supermarket is and to be going to the supermarket at the same time. I could be going to the supermarket, think I know where the supermarket is, right? But then suddenly realize that I'm like in a different city from where I thought I was, then I would stop, right? And then I might ask, I might say, which way is the supermarket? But I have to stop in order to ask, right? I could keep walking. Maybe I still want to have a walk or something, right? I keep walking and wonder where the supermarket is, but I can't keep walking to the supermarket and be wondering where the supermarket is. In order to be walking to the supermarket, I have to think I know where the supermarket is. Okay, so that's an example, but that's an example of not very foundational mandatory question, because it's easy for me to just stop walking to the supermarket, right? But then there are more foundational life projects that we have, like being a mother, right, that I have, being a teacher, but even more fundamentally, being a good person, right, where we can't put those projects on hold, right? We got to try to do them like all the time. I don't get to suspend being a mother, right, even when I'm not with my kids. And so these are these beliefs that we have, beliefs that are answers to mandatory questions, are going to give rise to distinctively stubborn Moore sentences, right? Because we can't suspend judgment, am I a good mother, right? Am I a good person? I need to believe that I'm a good mother or that I'm a good person, even as I'm asking that question. So I can't ask it. I've argued, okay? We can talk more about that if you like. But if these questions are no more askable than the corresponding Moore sentences are assertable, then they're going to give rise to a distinctively stubborn kind of Moore sentence, right? So I don't need to come to think it's not snowing, but I believe that it is, in order to investigate whether I'm wrong about the snow. But the project of rectifying the answer given in the answer to a mandatory question calls for just such a confrontation. Divergences between answers to mandatory questions and the truth can only be corrected by those who can represent them. Right? So the cost of adopting the standard solution, which is to say, admitting the unknowability of the relevant truth, would, in the case of stubborn Moore sentences, be a much more substantial cognitive sacrifice, right? In addition to not being able to assert or believe a sentence of the form, I'm currently wrong about X, I would also be unable to bring myself to be right about X, right? So there's reason to think that with respect to stubborn Moore sentences, we should hope to be able to approach Moore's paradox differently. And it becomes much more attractive to grab the other horn of the dilemma. We want to be able to assert them because that's the only route to correcting our error. Okay, but are Moore sentences ever assertable? Like, can you just assert a Moore sentence, right? You might say like that, we already know you can't do that, right? And now I want to give you evidence that we can do it by just pointing to you that there is one in the dialogue, the Alcibiades. I just put it in the chat. We'll look at the handout in a minute, right? So here in the chat, I have this sentence where at some point Socrates proposes and secures Alcibiades' agreement to a certain claim. Here's the claim. Alcibiades, the handsome son of Clinias, doesn't understand justice and injustice, though he thinks he does and is about to go to the assembly to advise the Athenians on what he doesn't know anything about. Okay, so if we allow X to stand for Alcibiades understands justice, then we have Alcibiades agreeing to a Moore-paradoxical sentence. X isn't the case, but I believe it is, right? Alcibiades doesn't understand justice, but I believe he does. Because Alcibiades agrees to this sentence. Moreover, in this case, X constitutes an answer that's for Alcibiades, a mandatory question. An earlier part of this chapter, I'm not giving you all of even this chapter, I talk about sort of why Alcibiades' knowledge of justice is an answer to, for him, a mandatory question. His life project of seeking rule rests on his claim to have a basis for advising the assembly. And this claim at this point in the dialogue rests on his understanding of justice. But it comes out even in this passage, right? Socrates makes clear that the Moore sentence is not the kind of trivial kind that's relegated to the past. Alcibiades continues to be about to go to the assembly to advise the Athenians on the strength of the wisdom he continues to think he has, even while agreeing that he doesn't have it. So unlike the presence or absence of snow, the presence or absence of wisdom isn't something that Alcibiades can suspend judgment about. He's in a condition of thinking he understands justice when he doesn't, and being aware that he takes himself to know what he doesn't in fact know. Okay, and this is, I think, like the classic case of like knowing your own ignorance. Okay, this is what it looks like. And part of what I want to be bringing out in this chapter is that knowing your own ignorance is something a lot more substantive than something very abstract like, well, I know I sometimes go wrong, or preface paradoxy stuff, like probably something I wrote in this book is wrong, right? There's actually such a thing as a confrontation with one's own ignorance, and this is what it looks like. And it's, this case I think is just very sharp in that it includes a Moore-paradoxical sentence just being asserted. Okay, but now you might wonder, wait a minute, I mean, does Alcibiades really deserve to be credited with asserting this sentence? Socrates is the one doing the talking here, right? So that might raise some suspicions. Moreover, if Alcibiades' agreement to this sentence is this kind of terse one word, he just says apparently, right? And he's clearly reluctant. So why not say that Socrates is the one who's understanding Alcibiades' ignorance, right? I mean, after all, isn't Socrates the one doing the talking here? So the answer is no. And this question, who is doing the talking in this passage, right, is actually thematized in the passage itself. So I want to actually go through it kind of in detail. So now you should open your Alcibiades, the first in the chat. Maybe if somebody could put it, Gia, could you just put it up again in case there are people that showed up late? Alcibiades 112 to 114 in English. I'm not gonna, yeah, you can also look at the Greek if you want, but I'm just gonna read through the English. Okay. Well then, given that your opinion wavers so much, given that you obviously neither found it out for yourself nor learned it from anyone else, how likely is it that you know about justice and injustice? From what you say anyway, it's not very likely. See, there you go again, Alcibiades. That's not well said. What do you mean? You say that I say these things. What? Aren't you saying that I don't understand justice and injustice? No, not at all. Well, am I? Yes. How? Here's how. If I ask you which is more, 1 or 2, would you say 2? I would. By how much? By 1. Then which of us is saying that 2 is more than 1? I am. Was it I asking and weren't you answering? Yes. Who do you think is saying these things? Me, the questioner, or you, the answerer? I am. And what if I asked you how to spell Socrates and you told me, which of us would be saying it? I would. Come then, give me the general principle. When there's a question and an answer, who is the one saying things, the questioner or the answerer? The answer, I think, Socrates. Wasn't I the questioner and everything just now? Yes. And weren't you the answerer? I certainly was. Well then, which of us said what was said? From what we agreed, Socrates, it seems I did. And now we have our passage. And what was said was that Alcibiades, the handsome son of Clinias, doesn't understand justice and injustice, though he thinks he does. And that he is about to go to the assembly and advise the Athenians on what he doesn't know anything about. Wasn't that it? Apparently. Then it's just like in Euripides, Alcibiades, you heard it from yourself, not from me. I'm not the one who says these things, you are. Don't try to blame me. And furthermore, you're quite right to say so. The scheme you have in mind, teaching what you don't know and haven't bothered to learn, your scheme, my good fellow, is crazy. Okay. So remember, there's no problem with other people saying your mistakes, right? There's no paradox in our saying to Jones, it's snowing in Chicago, though you, Jones, don't believe that it is. That kind of second personal Moore sentence is so unparadoxically commonplace that there's like a shorthand for them. We can say, you're wrong, right? We say that to people. But Socrates isn't telling Alcibiades you're wrong, or at any rate, that's not only what he's doing. That's what Alcibiades initially interprets Socrates as doing in the beginning of this passage, right? Aren't you saying that I don't understand justice and injustice? But Socrates corrects him. And he points out that Alcibiades, is the one making the relevant assertion, right? Socrates isn't saying that Alcibiades is wrong. Socrates is getting Alcibiades to say, I'm wrong, even if it takes some work on Socrates' part to get Alcibiades to see that those were his own words. Right? So Socrates, I think, here is emphasizing a really important feature of his method of question and answer. It creates a way for multiple people to be engaged in articulating the views of a single person. That's a really important way, for example, that Socratic conversation differs from debate. In debate, we have the opposing points of view presented, like 2 minds, 2 sets of views, right? There's a famous passage in the Gorgias that you're all familiar with where Socrates says, yeah, I don't do debates. Thank you, Gia. So in Socratic conversation, by contrast to debate, we have two minds, but only one set of views. When Alcibiades speaks, he's saying what Alcibiades thinks. When Socrates questions, he's also, provided Alcibiades' sense, saying what Alcibiades thinks. So the project of saying what Alcibiades thinks has been distributed over two people. Alcibiades benefits from this social expansion of the space of his thoughts because his views that he both knows and doesn't know justice don't fit into one mind. So maybe what I'll do is give you also, give me a second. I'm going to put in the chat some more passages. Okay. I'm probably going to read all of these, but maybe we'll just look at there are a bunch more passages from the Alcibiades in which this kind of confrontation with the wavering of one's own beliefs comes out. But we'll look at, I'm going to look at maybe just the first one, and you guys can look at the rest if you like. So this first one is really just about Alcibiades, what it looks like to Alcibiades when he introspects, which is that he feels fully clear in his knowledge of justice, right? So this is earlier in the conversation, Socrates pointed out that Alcibiades from childhood had felt fully clear upon introspecting that he knew. Socrates, when you were a boy, I often observed you at school and other places, and sometimes when you were playing knucklebones or some other game, you'd say to another of your playmates very loudly and confidently, not at all like somebody who was at a loss about justice and injustice, that he was a lousy cheater and he wasn't playing fairly. Isn't that true? Well, what was I to do, Socrates, when somebody cheated me like that? Do you mean, what should you have done if you didn't actually know then whether or not you were being cheated? But I did know, by Zeus. I saw clearly that they were cheating me. So it seems that even as a child, you thought you understood justice and injustice. Yes, and I did understand, said Alcibiades. Okay, so even as a young child, Alcibiades needed to draw on his knowledge of justice and injustice to navigate his life. It was a mandatory question for him even then. How much the more so now that he's embarking on politics, right? So he's not able to become aware on his own that he doesn't understand justice. When he introspects, he doesn't see his error, but instead continues to feel confident in his knowledge. I saw clearly that they were cheating me, and I did understand, he says. Okay, so if you try to introspect, you're not going to see your mistakes, not even the ones about the weather. And if those mistakes are the lens through which you see the world, you won't see them by looking out at the world either. Right? So the kind of mistake that infect the lens through which you see the world would just be fully inaccessible to you if you were working on your own. But with someone else asking you the right questions, instead of trying to see them, you can say them. Just quickly, I'm going to contrast, right? If you think about the snow case, right? You know, Jones might look at the window and say, oh, you're right, it is snowing. I was wrong. He'd say was, right? To see that it is snowing is to cease believing that it isn't. So there's no time where Jones could assert, however quickly, I don't believe it's snowing, no, it is. So a change of mind skips over the relevant Moore sentence, right? And so the feat that Socrates accomplishes is somehow to create a way to rest there in the being wrong, right? To rest there in the moment in between it's not snowing and looking out the window and being like, oh, it is snowing, right? And you might have thought there was no space there. And in fact, I think Socrates kind of discovered that there is a space there, but it's a social space. What I want to do now is, let's see, I have 10 more minutes. Okay, so I have time to, I want to, this thing Socrates does, right, is experienced by a lot of people as almost like a magic trick. Like, how did you do it? Like, how did you get me to say this stuff that I don't believe, right? But I'm speaking sincerely. And so I want just to remind you, these are very famous passages, but passages from a couple of other dialogues. where Socrates' his interlocutors sort of encounter this experience and are just mystified by it. And then I want to say a few words about the way Socrates glosses the experience in the Alcibiades. Okay, so let me once again give you what did I call this document? Oh, I think I called it aporia. Okay, yeah, these are that work? Yeah. Okay. So these are passages of aporia as a way to think about all of them. So the first one is Callicles, right? Is remember this moment in the Gorgias where Callicles is like almost convinced. But he wants to dismiss it. He's like, I don't know, Socrates, in a way you seem to me to be right, but the thing that happens to most people has happened to me. I'm not really persuaded by you. Okay, the next one is Adamantus in the Republic. No one will be able to contradict the things you've said, Socrates. But on each occasion, as you say them, your hearers are affected in some such way as this. They think that because they're inexperienced in asking and answering questions, they're led astray a little bit by the argument at every question. And that when these little bits are added together at the end of the discussion, great is their fall, as the opposite of what they said at the outset comes to light. Just as inexperienced checkers players are trapped by the experts in the end and can't make a move, so they too are trapped in the end and have nothing to say in this different kinds of checkers, which is played not with this, but with words, yet the truth is unaffected by its outcome. Okay, so Adamantus is reporting this experience where you're sort of indicted by the words coming out of your mouth. Great is their fall, right? And people feel like Socrates is doing something funny. He's some kind of funny business to make that happen, right? Euthyphro complains, is the next passage. I'm sorry I didn't give you the citations here, but if you want them, just email me. Euthyphro complains that Socrates is moving his words around. Euthyphro's making him say things he doesn't want to say. Socrates, I have no way of telling you what I have in mind, for whatever proposition we put forward goes around and refuses to say put where we establish it. Your statements, Euthyphro, seem to belong to my ancestor, Daedalus. If I were stating them and putting them forward, you would perhaps be making fun of me and say that because of my kinship with him, my conclusions in discussion run away and won't stay where one puts them. As these propositions are yours, however, we need some other jest, for they will not stay put as you say yourself. Euthyphro, I think the same jest will do for our discussion, Socrates, for I am not the one who makes them go around and not remain in the same place. It's you who are the Daedalus, for as far as I'm concerned, they've remained as they were. I won't even read the last bit. Okay, so I mean, here Socrates is reminding Euthyphro what he emphasized to Alcibiades. You're the one talking. But if Euthyphro believes that one of his definitions of piety is good, how can he honestly and sincerely be brought to say the opposite? Likewise, if Alcibiades believes he understands justice, how can he sincerely come to assert that he doesn't? So the power to get someone to sincerely assert what lies contrary to their beliefs might seem like a kind of sorcery, like a magic. And that's exactly what how Meno describes it, right? I think Meno is the most eloquent in describing this experience. Socrates, before I even met you, I used to hear that you're always in a state of perplexity and that you bring others to the same state. And now I think you're bewitching and beguiling me, putting me under a spell so that I'm quite perplexed. Indeed, if a joke is in order, you seem in appearance and in every other way to be like the broad torpedo fish, for it too makes anyone who comes close and touches it feel numb. And you now seem to have had that kind of effect on me, for both my mind and my tongue are numb, and I have no answer to give you, yet I have made many speeches about virtue for large audiences on 1,000 occasions, very good speeches as I thought, but now I can't even say what it is. I think you're wise not to sail away from Athens and go stay elsewhere, for if you were to behave like this as a stranger in another city, you'd be driven away from practicing sorcery. Okay, so the word here, right, aporia, that we're all familiar with, it means lacking away, right, not having a poros. And Meno is using it to describe the emotions of the person who's been brought to assert a stubborn Moore sentence. He feels lost, unable to move on, bereft of resources, seeing no way forward, paralyzed. It's really stunning if you think of it, that Meno's description comes to us from inside of the experience of being wrong. Meno, like Alcibiades, continues to cling to his knowledge, both of what virtue is, right, and of his competence at explicating it with good speeches. But because he hasn't changed his mind, he's able to inhabit the experience of being wrong and describe it for us. Being wrong feels like having your own words become alienated from you, as your skin is when it feels numb, having your own words go on to betray you, right? But he blames Socratic wizardry. Socrates defends himself, right? And then I give you a quote of Socrates. If the torpedo fish is itself numb and so makes others numb, then I resemble it, but not otherwise. For I myself do not have the answer when I perplex others, but I am more perplexed than anyone when I cause perplexity in others. So now I do not know what virtue is. Perhaps you knew before you contacted me, but now you are certainly like one who does not know. Nevertheless, I want to examine and seek together with you what it may be. Okay, so what is Socrates saying to Meno here? He's saying there's no trick, there's no magic, there's no potion. The reason that he puts his interlocutors into this puzzling condition is simply that he is in it himself, right? And I think I didn't give you this, but there's a famous passage even from the Apology, right? Where Socrates says, in every case, the bystanders to his refutations thought that I myself possessed the wisdom that I proved my interlocutor did not have. It's actually common even to this day that people are inclined to attribute some special wisdom to Socrates, right? They think he's in some kind of much better condition than his interlocutors, but he keeps insisting that the key to his success is that he's in the very same condition that they are. And I think that that is a really key piece of information about how Socrates creates the space within which refutation becomes possible. If your own error is invisible because it colors the very lens with which you view the world, there's still a way it might be seen by being present in another who's just like oneself. By being wrong in just the way that they are, Socrates can help other people see their own wrongness. So here's how he describes it in the Alcibiades. Let me just check and make sure I gave you this passage. Oh yeah, good. I'll tell you, so this is about the gnosis auton, right? Socrates is interpreting the gnosis auton. I'll tell you what I suspect that inscription means and what advice it's giving us. There may not be many examples of it except in the case of sight. What do you mean by that? You think about it too. If the inscription took our eyes to be men and advised them, see thyself, how would we understand this advice? Shouldn't the eye be looking at something in which it could see itself? Obviously. Then let's think of something that allows us to see both it and ourselves when we look at it. Obviously, Socrates, you mean mirrors and that sort of thing. Quite right. And isn't there something like that in the eye which we see with? Certainly. Goes on. Okay. One thing that a person can be for another person is a mirror. Thus, Socrates concludes that, right, in this passage, he concludes that if the soul is to know itself, it must look at a soul. So Socrates found a way to mirror the ignorance of those around him so that by engaging with him, they would find themselves looking right at their own errors. Instead of voicing his own opinions, he speaks in such a way as to reflect both sides of the thinking of the person he's talking to. In order to see your mistakes, there need to be two yous. Socrates plays the role of the other you. The reason that this is necessary, right? Why do you need two yous in order to see your own thinking? Is that our thinking is on certain points, namely mandatory questions, subject to two incompatible demands. The one demand is to have a belief. Right? You have to have a belief, so the suspension of judgment is impossible, it's prohibited. This demand is specific to mandatory questions. The other demand is to only believe what is true. This demand applies to all beliefs, right? And it, of course, underlies Moore's paradox. The reason I can't say it's not knowing though I believe it is the demand to believe only what's true. The problem is that if you can't suspend judgment, then you can't look into the question. Then you have no reason to think that what you think about it is actually the truth. You can't attend to both of these demands at once any more than you can self-consciously believe a contradiction. Because the things you think don't fit together, your inward eye only has space for a subset of them. That's why the words coming out of your mouth can surprise you. At the behest of another, a picture of yourself can emerge that was introspectively invisible. Socrates discovered that the space of speech is more capacious than the space of thought. It allows you to see your mistakes. The other side of this discovery is that each human being considered on their own is in a fundamental way deficient, in need of both help and improvement. As a side point, one way you see this psychologically come out in the dialogues is when and actually in interpersonal conversation is when you make a grudging admission, right? So I'm arguing with someone and I'm like, oh, I guess I have to admit, or I guess I have to say, or I think every time I make a grudging admission, and Alcibiades makes a grudging admission in the passage we're looking at, apparently, right? Someone is getting you to say words that you wouldn't have said if you were sitting by yourself introspecting, right? So the words that are being extracted from you are extracted under the pressure, the force of the conversation. So the grudging admission, far from being a sign of insincerity, is actually a sign of the expanded space of conversation. Okay, so in the Theaetetus, just final comment here, and then we'll be done. In the Theaetetus, Socrates describes thinking as a conversation with oneself, right? He says the soul, when it thinks, is simply carrying on a discussion in which it asks itself questions and answers them itself, affirms and denies. Similar description in the Sophist. If thinking is talking to yourself, then talking to another who plays the role of yourself is also thinking. And if the topic requires that the self with whom you converse be embodied in another, talking to another turns out to be the only way for you to think about it. Some kinds of thinking, namely thinking about mandatory questions, are essentially collaborative. You can't have the thought by yourself. So with Socrates' help, Alcibiades manages to explore the thoroughly familiar territory of his own self as though it were uncharted waters. He does this by gainsaying his own conception of himself. Though he thinks he knows, he also sincerely verbally acknowledges that he doesn't. That process of verbal indictment, which is also called Socratic refutation, is one and the same process as the process of inquiring into mandatory questions. Even if blind spots can't be inwardly seen, they can be spoken, outwardly seen by being mirrored in another. That is the way to be wrong. Thanks.
Okay, well, I'll clap on behalf of many people. And we'll move to the discussion. The way we do that in this series, for those of you who haven't been here, is that we use the raise your hand function. Raise your hand, and then I will call on people. If you have some problem making this work, either send me a private chat or send an email to the Socrates Society email address if you're somehow having a problem with the Zoom functions. So I invite comments and questions. Brad Inwood.
Great, thank you very much, Agnes. That was wonderful. I wondered, just to maybe clarify something about that moment of paralysis that you described so beautifully. And I can see the relevance of seeing it in sort of the Moore sentence framework, but could we instead just say, look, this is a diachronic thing. He believed it before, and now he's put in a position because of the way the conversations run that he doesn't believe it now. And he's in fact not acknowledging this moment of conflict because it's a mandatory question. What he's actually doing is, in an embarrassed, oblique way, changing his mind. I mean, can it be parsed that way as well?
Great question. So, and like basically the next chapter after this chapter is me actually trying to work out the mechanics of the conversation and how this works, and that's not in here. I'm just sort of giving you like, hey, look, it seems like this can happen. But what I think is that the very part of why conversation is different from just thinking is that in a conversation, you're held to what you said earlier, unless you disavow it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you say, well, in effect, like the stuff I said in my talk just a minute ago, I'm still saying it, right? Like I'm not like I'm making those sounds, but you can call me on it, right? So there's a way in which I am still even now saying all the things that I said in my talk. And so I can contradict myself in virtue of that, right? But suppose that you weren't here and I had just been thinking about it, right? Then I think I can think, well, earlier I thought this thing, right? But do I still think it now? And so it seems to me that thinking really collapses into the diachronic, But talking allows you to stand under the claims that you made in the past and to be liable to them. And that's sort of exactly what Socrates is doing. Like in this passage, he's reminding Alcibiades, right, of stuff he's agreed to. I think there are, well, yeah. So let me just say that much and let you respond. There's lots more I could say about this. It's a very central question of my project.
Right. So no, I do want to follow up just briefly because I know there's going to be lots of questions. So I guess it's a question of the way the interlocutor responds when they get caught and wind up having to say something which is contrary to what they still believe. It seems to me that one response is to just throw up your hands and say, I'm confused, and not actually make the conflicting assertion. Another thing you can do that some interlocutors might do is to actually repudiate what they said before. In other words, they refuse to stand under the claims they made. Now, Socrates, no doubt, typically wants people to stay committed to their earlier positions, but in a real world conversation, we are not so bound. I mean, I change my mind in the course of an argument all the time. And when you talked about grudging admissions, I think you're sort of circling around the variety of intellectual and emotional responses we have to being caught out that way. So I think it's sort of a typology. It'd be really interesting to see a kind of typology of reactions to those moments in so many dialogues.
Great. So I think that everything you're saying is right, but the really important backdrop here is that Socrates is focusing on and really forcing his interlocutors to remain focused on the ways in which these questions are mandatory for them, right? So Euthyphro, maybe he's going to be willing to give up the idea that piety is just what I'm doing now, right? As long as he can hold on to the thought, I know what piety is, right? I better know what it is because I'm about to prosecute this law case where I have really no chance of saying that I'm in the right unless I have special, really good knowledge of piety, right? And Socrates is very careful to remind him of that. And in a way to think about it is Socrates is selecting his questions using this. What is mandatory for the person that I'm talking to? And that's a way of saying, what can I stick them to? What can I hold them to? And is constantly reminding them of this fact. And I think that, when we say I'm confused, what we're saying is, for the moment, I'm going to suspend judgment about this question. Like maybe it's P, maybe it's not P, I don't know. And I even think sort of intellectually, it can be possible. I can be like, what is virtue? I'm confused about that. I'm reading Aristotle, I'm reading Kant, and I'm confused, right? But Socrates, that there's a kind of abstract conversation one can have about virtue where one can entertain that confusion, but it doesn't feel like it has bearing of indicting your life, right? And Socrates wants to talk to people, what is virtue? Someone like Meno, who is like actively engaged in the virtue building project, right? And let's not let Meno forget that for a minute while we talk to him about virtue. And so, I think Socrates' question or his sort of project is trying to expose the kind of contradiction, the kind of getting caught when in effect, the mandatoriness of the question and your inability to answer it, like both are present to you with full force.
Can I just one last thought? So there are cases where what the interlocutor says is, well, that seems to follow from what we've said, or given previous agreements, that seems to follow. I mean, I would guess from what you've just said that those are places where the interlocutor is kind of explicitly bracketing and saying, no, I don't want to stand under. I'm conditionalizing the dilemma I'm now in. And maybe that's a move that's only available for a non-mandatory question. I'm just trying to follow out your line of thought.
Yeah, I think so. There are so many different moves that interlocutors make. And in a way, I mean, I think that this moment in the Alcibiades is a particularly pure, or it's like a window. It's like, but I think in a way, you have to see the pressure of this moment as being in the background every time the interlocutor is like, well, that seems to follow, right? Alcibiades wanted to say the same thing. He wanted to say, oh, you're saying, right? And so like, and I think Socrates doesn't always produce the sort of pressure to expose it in as cleanly as he does right here in the Alcibiades, but I think that actually like that whole first part of the Meno is Meno being caught, right? He's caught in this trap, even at moments where he will talk about it in way, like he's trying to talk himself out of the thought that he's caught, right? And the idea is like, well, that seems to follow is almost a way of trying to talk yourself out of it. Like, actually, it seems true, right? But you're going to use words, you're going to use these alienating words, right? And so I think in a way the phenomenon is much broader, and it manifests in these like in these ways that are sort of less direct, but they're still the grudging admission that it seems to follow, the why don't you leave me alone, Socrates. There's a bunch of passages I gave you that I didn't read from the Alcibiades. All of those are also manifestations of this same thing, just less direct ones.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, Nick Smith.
Yeah, hi, that was very interesting. I'm wondering if there's maybe another, this in a way there's a follow-up on what Brad was asking. I wonder if there's not another aspect to the issue. One of the things that I've been interested in is sort of why people come to believe the things they do, or why they hold the beliefs that they do. And if that turns out to be a fairly complicated issue, that is that there can be different etiologies of belief, that one of the things that an encounter of Socrates can do is sort of confront an interlocutor with his own sort of bad cognitive habits, right? And so part of what happens is that Socrates shows that there are sort of reasons for belief that are in conflict with what the interlocutor actually believes. And in many cases, that process doesn't just sort of change on a dime, because the beliefs themselves come from a fairly intractable etiology, right? So when he tells his jurors, for example, in the Apology, don't vote against me in anger. Well, you know, it's perfectly possible, I confess from my own case, that one can be angry and do things that even at the time one does them, one is thinking, you're wrong, this is no, right? So there are these sort of passions that people can enact, and they do, in Socrates' view, reflect belief, but they can come into conflict, or they can come into contact. And Socrates is really good at making that contact with sort of different etiologies of belief. And in my view, that's when you start seeing these sort of strange reactions, that, you know, as you say, almost Moorean reactions in the interlocutors. I just wondered if you wanted to have some comment about that.
Yeah, so I actually have a whole other chapter about where beliefs come from. And I think that you're right. And I have my own actually quite specific conception of what the bad cognitive habits are. I think there are two kinds. So, and I'm sorry about the fact that I had to compress a lot of the earlier stuff in the book to make this work. But so I said that there are these mandatory questions, right, where we live our lives on the basis of answers to those questions, and we can't inquire into them. That is, at least in the sense of we can't pose the questions to ourselves. The reason we can't pose the questions to ourselves is that we can't suspend judgment. So we're not able to pose the question. And so you might wonder how do we have answers at all, right? How do we live? Like where did we get these answers? So I think that Socrates, in effect, if you sort of sift through the dialogues, there are two sorts of answers. One is the body. So pleasure and pain, fear of death, desire for wealth. There's a set of answers that we have to how to live. And those answers are sometimes captured in the phrase, the beneficial. So that's one set of answers. You know, in the Republic, when Socrates says, when we desire something, the soul is nodding yes as if in answer to a question, right? That's kind of like, I'm hearing that's like a mandatory question, right? So the body just gives us like automatic answers, like what should you do? Like when you're hungry, you just think you have an answer, namely I should eat, right? So that's one source of answers. The other source of answers is kinship relations, okay? So belonging to groups. So you should protect your friends and stick up for your friends. And so a lot of what comes under the description, the admirable, okay, or the just, for most people is respect your kinship relations. Socrates thinks both of these have just fatal flaws. The problem with the body is that it like tells you to pursue wealth and it tells you to fear death, and those neither of those things are like good in themselves. The problem with the kinship relations is that they tell you to pursue revenge. But what he brings out, and so this is, I think, how, and I actually have this little discussion of this in the chapter version of this chapter, but because I hadn't brought that, I didn't want to say it to you guys, is that these two answers are actually like intention in a lot of cases. So, and it comes out in the Alcibiades, basically whenever Socrates is talking to someone about how they think the beneficial and the admirable can come apart, I see that as code for the mandatory answer that comes from your body and the mandatory answer that comes from the kinship relation can come apart, and therefore you don't have a theory of the good. Okay, so that's like, I have a whole theory of why people have bad cognitive habits or their bad answers, right? They got these answers automatically, either from social conformity and kinship relations or from their bodies. Those are not good ways to get answers to questions about how to live. Therefore, you can bring that out. You can expose that the answers people have are bad answers by just showing them that their sources were not good, and particularly that they're not consistent with one another. So I think that's absolutely right. And I think that those, but I think it's also right, as you're sort of bringing out, that those answers are quite sticky, that they, and thus that like people kind of keep giving those answers. And so like when Callicles says, I'm not really, in a way you seem right, but I'm not really persuaded by you. And then Socrates says, well, it's the love of the demos in your soul, right? It's that kinship relation that is pulling against me. And so I think that that's right. And so it's right that, you know, getting people to actually inquire into these things is a matter of getting them to give up certain kinds of reflexive answers that in effect come to you automatically or for free. And that's like a very hard thing to do. And it requires like repetition and doing it a bunch of times.
Sandra Peterson.
Hi, thank you for the talk. My question is I'm just trying to understand. What I understood was your point is that by the rules of the question answer game, the speaker can be forced, or the interlocutor can be forced to speak a more paradoxical sentence. But now I'm wondering, what about thinking a more paradoxical sentence? And well, that's my question. What happened there?
I'm so glad you asked the question. The answer is that is what thinking a more paradoxical sentence is. That is, there are forms, the sort of point of my argument here is that there are forms of thinking that can only happen out loud. So maybe an analogous to sort of see the kind of claim I'm making, another thinker who made a claim of this kind is Freud. So Freud thought that there are certain kinds of thoughts, namely the thoughts that you have in transference, that can only show up in the psychoanalytic situation, right? So you can't like be sitting in your room and like be having the transference and thinking about it. It can only happen in analysis. You actually need the other person to be there, right? So you could say there are thoughts that are like a bicycle built for two, and like you can't have them by yourself. And the way you have the thought is by having a certain conversation. So I think that, you know, that's what's happening with these more paradoxical sentences. In a way, what makes Moore's paradox seem so intractable is that we're actually trying to frame it in a kind of one person solipsistic way. And it is a paradox if you try to make it a one person situation. But Moore's paradox was actually a bicycle built for two. And thus you can, in a Socratic exchange, you can just see it be asserted and it's not a problem.
Right, thank you.
Hugh Benson.
Sorry, I had to figure out how to unmute myself. Thanks. I really enjoyed the paper. Lots of things I'd like to ask about because I like them so much. But what you just said to Sandra, I wonder if, so it seems, unfortunately for me, I guess, that I have lots of inconsistent beliefs. I seldom bring them together, but nevertheless, I do have inconsistent beliefs. I wonder if you think that that's another, to think P and not P is another thing I can only have in conversation. That's another thought that I can only have in conversation. So it's not just connected to Moorean sentences, but there's lots of sentences that I can only think in conversation.
That's a great question. I'm not sure you can think them in conversation. I'm not sure my view gives you that much.
Okay.
So I think that the kind of space that I'm creating for thinking what seems like a contradiction, though it's not logically a contradiction, right?
No.
Because it's P, but I don't believe it. That's the funny thing about more sentences, right? The kind of thing that the kind of space that I'm creating is predicated on it's being on a special topic, namely an answer to a mandatory question, because that is what gives it a kind of stickiness of like belonging, of like having to belong to you in a way, right? So like there's kind of a rule that you're under, which is always believe the true. And because you're under that rule, when you come across anything that seems false or contradictory, you just suspend judgment, right? To follow that rule. But sometimes you're also under another rule, which is you have to have a belief about P, right? For some propositions. And when you're under that rule, that's when you're in this tension situation. And what I want to say is that when you're in that tension, when you're under that tension, then there can be things you're in effect disposed to assert that you cannot recognize as being the property of your own mind because you're recognizing something else as being the property of your mind, like whichever thing you're, so it's precisely P, but I don't believe P, right? Or the other one, right? So in effect, the words coming out of your mouth and your introspective experience don't match. So it's not belief in a contradiction, it's that more weird thing. And I think at least Socrates only shows you how to do that for a special set of topics.
So I now see why you're motivated not to let it get too big. The number of things we can think. But so how does it get blocked? So that what our conversation leads me to see not only that I believe P, but I believe not P. But that's not thinking. That's just something that came out in our conversation, but it's not my thinking P and not P.
It's that you did, by the time I show you that you, like, I convince you of not P, you no longer believe the P, right? Or you suspend judgment. So in effect, there's a kind of automaticity of the suspension of judgment that is in play when you're like, oh no, I don't think that anymore. That's what I used to think before you show me the other thing, right? But
Okay.
If you're not allowed to not think it anymore because you're under this rule, then that's, but I want to say that in terms of the restriction, it's just a formal restriction. And so you could ask me, okay, what are the subjects on which we have, like, are there mandatory questions? And I think people differ wildly about this. I think there's common ground for all of us. Being a good person is that topic. We all have to be good people all the time, and we're all committed to the idea that we're good people all the time. But like, how about I have a basic understanding of like the natural world. Is that a mandatory question? I think for me, it's like kind of not. And for my husband, it is. And that's just like a different way that we live. Like he's much more of a theoretical reason person than I am. I'm much more of a practical reason person. And so the set of questions that are mandatory for us are different. And like from one person, being a mother might be a mandatory question. And then for other people throughout history, it might be like, okay, I'm a mother, but I don't care that much about my kids. Like that's possible, it's imaginable, right? So you know, it's restricted, but only in this formal way. As a substantive matter, I can sort of like, I could probably come up with a story on which almost anything would be a mandatory question for a given person.
Thanks.
Mariana Noe?
Thank you. First of all, thanks for the talk, of course. I really like the idea of expanding the space of conversation. But I wonder if we talk about mirroring others, about being almost magical, about turning others in the same state or like, yeah, in the same state that you are mentally. I wonder how much Socrates ends up resemble Ion at the end of the day. So if we raise the agenda of Socrates as an interlocutor, don't you think that we become liable of being accused of assimilating philosophy to poetry, basically?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that it's a great question, but notice that Socrates is actually very resistant to the idea that he's some kind of wizard, right? So he is getting accused of this, like in effect, you could say, Meno is saying to Socrates, you're like Ion or something, right? And Socrates is like, no, I'm actually just like you. Right. So in a way, what your question brings out is that there are actually high stakes for Socrates in persuading people that he's just like them. Right. And that in effect, what he's saying is, no, this is actually what you look like, like in effect. And so I don't, you know, in a way, like you're right, I was pressing the wizardry angle because I do think it's amazing that he figured this out, that he figured out a way for us to speak sincerely against ourselves. But I think, and as I say, the next chapter is sort of my account of like the mechanism of how that works, that it didn't come in here, but I don't think that it is magic. I think that it is philosophy, but specifically refutation, right? And that the way that it's achieved is through, I'll just say a sentence because I don't want to spend too much time summarizing other chapters because I feel like I want to get to all the questions, but the way that it's achieved is a kind of division of labor between the two demands that I mentioned. So there's the demand to believe P, and then there's the demand to like believe only what's true, right? And so Socrates is doing the believe only what's true one, and then the interlocutor is doing the believe the P one. And that kind of separation of the two demands allows for an exploration of an idea. And I think it's not wizardry, right? It can be explained in a way that Ion is not capable of explaining. And that's why you have to get the magnetic rings image of like, I guess it's just the gods trickling down to you. But Socrates does give an account of himself.
Andre, I'm not going to be able to get your last name, but please ask your question.
Hello, Professor. Sorry for my bad English. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I'm a long-time Twitter fan, so it's really an honor to finally see in person. But I'd like to ask you about the openness in the conversation. I have some problems in my day-to-day life, and I believe that Socrates probably had a lot more of them than me, about making the interlocutor, the person you are talking to, believe that you actually see an error in their point of view. Sometimes people just think you are trying to defeat them in conversation. You're just a Philonikus, like Callicles calls Socrates, and they think you just want to play with them. You are trying to trick them with words or something like that. And it's very hard to have a conversation with an unknown person, a stranger, and actually get to better ground with this conversation. It may be possible with friends and maybe with brothers and sisters and parents, but it's really hard to do that in some areas like politics. It's very hard, at least for me, to convince the person that I'm talking to that I actually want to find a better position than my own or her or his own. So I'd like to ask you if there is a way to stimulate that openness, to convince the person that the conversation is not a fight, it's not a competition, but actually a cooperation to get to better ground. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. And in a way, so I have a later chapter is about Socratic politics. And I have a talk online about, which I sort of give the current draft of that chapter. But I think it's absolutely an important question. And, you know, one thing to face up to is that this method is adversarial, right? It's, I think it's quite friendly and loving. And Socrates says, refutation is the greatest favor that one human being can do another, right? In the Gorgias. So but it is adversarial. And I think that is the thing that people are experiencing. They're rightly experiencing it's being adversarial. And so the question is, how do you not get the adversarial quality of refutation confused for some kind of zero-sum game where you are getting one over on them, you're just trying to make them look bad, you're trying to make the crowd love you, etc. So what's sort of charming about the Socratic dialogues is like, it's sort of the first time someone runs into this problem, and he tries to do it so directly, like namely by saying what I just said, like to Gorgias, to Protagoras. He'll be like, oh no, this isn't the thing where I'm trying to like do a speech that beats your speech. I'm doing a different thing. It's philosophy. We're both learning, right? And there's this wonderful naivete of someone just straight up saying like, trying to explain that this is what's happening, right? And like, he doesn't do so badly. Yes, people are grudging and they struggle with it, but like, it's very striking. One thing that's very striking about the Socratic dialogues to me, and that's not often discussed, is the non-repetition of interlocutors, almost entirely non-repetition of interlocutors, depending on what you think about the Hippias major being authentic or not. But Socrates is always talking to new people, and Plato is always showing him talking to new people, right? People who are different from one another. It's not like you could have imagined a version of the Socratic dialogues that was just Socrates and Plato talking together for 2,000 pages, right? And that's not what Plato gives us. And I think because he wants us to see Socrates confronting this problem with different people under different circumstances. Some of them are his friends, some of them are young people who are inclined to quite a different problem, right? Inclined to sort of be shy, like Charmides, right? Maybe agree too readily. Some people are like Protagoras, Gorgias, and Hippias. They have a really big stake in looking good, and you might have said, well, can you do philosophy with such a person? And then Plato's answer is, look, here's how he did it, right? So I think that you're right that there's an issue, and it's not. I mean, we don't have a formula in the Socratic dialogues for doing it, but I do think that one lesson that I take away from just the sheer variety in the dialogues and the not shying away from really difficult characters like Thrasymachus and Callicles is, I imagine Plato looking forward like thousands of years ahead and saying, what are people going to say to themselves when they're going to say things like, well, so-and-so is a hard case. I don't have to talk to him, you know? He's like, so I better write a dialogue where Socrates is talking to a hard case so people don't make that excuse to themselves, right? I think that, you know, the sort of, the ethos that I see Socrates as having in relation to this problem is beggars can't be choosers. That I, Socrates, am desperate. I don't have knowledge. And there are these other people out there who might have it. And I better do like whatever it takes to get them to talk to me, because this is my only hope, right? So rather than the way we tend to think politically, which is like, there's some idiots out there, how do we get them to see that they should get vaccines or something, right? So like that mode of thinking is really different, because it means you think you have knowledge and you're like, how do I shove my knowledge down the throat of these people who don't want it? And Socrates is more of a beggars can't be choosers. Like, I'm desperate. This person might have knowledge. Let me try and do everything I can to make them like give it to me, right? So I think that maybe that, I mean, I said there's a lot of different methods in the Socratic dialogues, and they're trying to address this question. But the most basic one is understand how desperate you are and how much you need other people.
All right, maybe I'll offer myself an opportunity to ask a question here at this point. There's one fundamental thing you said that I'm not sure I understood, and on the understanding I have of it, I doubt that it's true. So this is, I get your point that it's mandatory for all of us that we have a view about what the good life is. But you said several times, I think, that it's mandatory that all of us think that we're a good person. And that seems to me a strange thing to say or believe. One decisive counterexample is a traditional Catholic with a strong sense of sin. Done.
Good. I mean, I think that you know, if I'm thinking back on what I actually say in the book, I'm sort of assuming that what we that we all think that in order to live a good life, I have to be a good person. And if you don't assume that, then all of my arguments still go. It's just that what's going to be mandatory is going to attach to good life, not good person. However, so in fact, nothing in my argument rests on that particular claim. But I think I maybe do still want to defend it. I mean, I think that the Catholic who has a strong, well, so I'm not Catholic, and so maybe I'm just like not gripping the thought, but you know, it seems to me that the Catholic is very committed to something like being a good person as their project and being able to be oriented towards that project. Now, maybe the thought isn't I'm a good person right now, right? But the thought is something like I'm oriented towards being a good person. And in effect, then what I would say is like for the Catholic, that sort of corresponds to what I meant by being a good person. That is the sense of themselves that they have to have in order to get through the day is I'm oriented towards being a good person, being a sinless person, right? I'm driven by that thought. Everything I do is underwritten by that project, right? That's the version, that's how we would put the mandatory question for them. And so, and that's the form of goodness that they think they have. And in a way, that's sort of quite similar to Socrates' own self-conception, right? He doesn't think of himself as virtuous. I mean, in order to be virtuous, you'd have to have knowledge, and he doesn't have it, right? But I think he thinks that there is a kind of virtuous orientation that you can have even when you don't have knowledge, and he's trying to have that. And so, and this is another view that I have, though I'm not even sure how much the book will cover this, but like he thinks there are sort of conversational virtues. There's conversational justice and conversational generosity and conversational moderation, and like and those things, you know, real virtue would be knowledge, right? But there's such a thing as being oriented towards being a good person, and that's you know, Socrates is committed to seeing himself that way. So these mandatory questions are no less mandatory for Socrates, by the way, than for any of the rest of us. He's not any different from us in this respect. So yeah, I take your point that thinking that you're successfully being is not necessarily going to be the way everyone sees themselves. Like there are going to be sort of ethical outlooks that don't require you to see yourself that way, and that are going to have more of a kind of aspirational self-conception of what it is to live well. And I think that's compatible with what I'm saying here.
Well, I think it's fairly brilliant of you when I bring up the Catholic with a strong sense of sin, and you point out that Socrates is in an important way analogous. That's an imaginative move, and it sounds right to me. Nick Smith. You've got to unmute yourself.
Yes, if there are no others, I don't want to.
No, go ahead. You go ahead.
Well, so I wanted to ask about just a couple of passages, and I think they're familiar to most people. So you've been emphasizing that Socrates is really in the same boat. He's desperate. You used that word a couple of times. You know, he's absolutely on a par with his interlocutors, cognitively, intellectually, and such. That doesn't quite ring true to me, although it rings true to a degree, right? So here's my worry. Socrates certainly does understand that he's ignorant. He certainly does understand that insofar as he's ignorant, he's in the same boat as everyone else and he's desperate and all the stuff you said. But there are times that Socrates seems to show something else. These have caught my attention. I just wanted to ask for you to attend to them for a second. So for example, in the Apology, I'm just using the big red book here. So, but in the Apology,
What page are you on? I have that book too.
37b, and he says, I'm convinced I wrong no one. Now, I wonder whether Socrates would be willing to say that about most of his interlocutors, or in fact, very many other people on earth. That's a remarkable boast. And it's not just that, I can't remember, or, probably have wronged a lot of people, but don't know it. This is in present tense. I'm convinced I wrong no one. The other one I wanted to ask about, similar case, the closing paragraph of the Gorgias, where he tells Callicles, so listen to me and follow me to where I am. And when you've come here, you'll be happy both in life and at the end. That's not desperate, that's preaching. And that's sort of telling Callicles, look, dude, you're wrong and I'm right. And so if you follow me, you're going to do a whole lot better. There's not much of that, I agree. But I wonder how that fits with this notion of the Socrates who's just as bad off as Meno, say.
Yeah, great question. I think it precisely supports it, because Meno is inclined to be just as sure of himself, right? So I think, by the way, that there are more passages like that. So in the Gorgias, all the claims that are bound with iron and adamant, right? People are always like, every dialogue is aporetic. Gorgias is not aporetic. Like, how could, if you wanted to be like very clearly saying there's a bunch of stuff we've concluded and we're not in aporia about, how would you write it? You'd write it the way Plato wrote the Gorgias, right? Like, here are the answers that we have come to for sure, right? So I think Socrates is not shy of saying, here's stuff that I know, like that I want to claim and that I have a great argument for and that is true, right? And in effect is presenting it as knowledge. Like I even that I think it's okay. We can even go that far. I think the whole Phaedo, in a way, right? Soul is immortal, and then it's like, here's a whole bunch of arguments for that. I'm right. Let me throw in a myth at the end, right? Just like at the Gorgias. I think that Socrates really is like everybody else, namely there are certain mandatory questions for him on which he has to think that he has answers, and he is going to come out just as strong saying, I'm sure about this, as anybody else would. And that's why he invites Callicles to refute him. He's like, the biggest favor that you could do for me would be to show me that I'm wrong about some of this stuff, right? I think I'm right, and I think you're wrong. And so one of the things I'm trying to do here is to say Socratic ignorance, like, isn't quite the kind of humility usually taken as. Socratic ignorance is like an experience, there's like almost imagine a roller coaster, the Socratic experience, right? There's an experience that Alcibiades is having, and it feels a certain way. It has a phenomenology. Meno is like, it feels like you're numb. It feels like your tongue doesn't behave, right? Socrates is not continuously always having that experience, right? That would be a weird person, right? I think Socrates sort of has that experience as part of the project of refuting people. And he can become aware of his own ignorance, but and you can say he has that kind of available to him, maybe more available than other people, but he too like has to live his life, and he has to think he's living it rightly, at least in the Catholic sense, right? And thus to think that he has located a kind of way of being virtuous while you're ignorant, and that allows him to avoid injustice, right, which he thinks is super important. But suppose he's wrong about that. Like, would he want to know? Absolutely, right? And so he's inviting people to refute him. But that's exactly the way in which he is just like everyone else. He's just as assertive as everybody else. And the only way that he can learn that he's wrong about those things is not by adopting some meta attitude, like I'm probably wrong about one of these things, but for someone to come and refute him.
All right, well, let's thank our speaker for a wonderful talk and conversation. And I hope I'll see all the rest of you in 2 weeks. Now I'll applaud for all the muted people.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Those were great questions. This was really fun.
It's been fun for all of us. See you, I hope, in 2 weeks.
Bye.
Bye.